I should have said no. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray Tennessee sky that makes everything feel heavier. My friend Rachel had called last minute, her kid spiked a fever, and she begged me to cover her in-home pet care shift for one of her long-term clients. It's just one night, she said. Dog's old, but sweet. You'll barely notice he's there. I said yes, mostly out of guilt. Rachel had taken my shifts when I had the flu last winter. The address she texted me made my breath catch before I even pulled into the driveway. I hadn't been to that house in 3 years. It looked the same. Long gravel path, white wraparound porch, pale green shutters like something out of a Southern Living magazine. But I wasn't here for nostalgia. I parked, grabbed my overnight bag, and reminded myself I was doing a job, not stepping into the past. When the front door opened, it wasn't a stranger who greeted me. It was Reed. And just like that, time snapped back like a rubber band. He stood there in jeans and a dark Henley shirt, his hair slightly longer than I remembered. There were new lines around his mouth, like life had pressed itself into him harder than it used to. But the moment our eyes locked, I knew he recognized me, just like I had recognized his name on the mailbox. His jaw tensed. Lena, I should have said something. Anything. But then a bark broke the silence, low and hoarse, followed by the sound of paws scraping against hardwood. Whiskey came barreling around the corner. 3 years older now, slower but unmistakably the same shaggy retriever who used to sleep with his head on my feet. He stopped when he saw me. And then whimpered. My heart cracked in a place I thought had long healed. Hey, buddy. I crouched down, hand out. He sniffed it once, then leaned his full weight against my leg's tail, wagging slowly. Reed hadn't moved. He looked like he was trying to decide whether this was a dream or a nightmare. I didn't know, I said finally. Rachel didn't tell me it was you. He nodded, eyes unreadable. She probably didn't know. A silence fell again. Whiskey nudged my hand and I scratched behind his ears like I used to. He's been sick, Reed said. Stopped eating this week. Vet says it's stress. I had to go out of town for 3 days, and he doesn't do well without someone here. He didn't explain why he called Rachel and not someone else. I didn't ask. I can find someone else, he added. If it's too weird. It was weird. But not in the way he meant. It was the kind of weird where your heart knows something your brain hasn't caught up with yet. I shook my head. It's one night. I'll manage. He nodded again, slow and unsure. His meds are in the cabinet. Food in the fridge. I'll be back late tomorrow. I could feel the tension humming between us like the low thrum of a distant train, but we didn't touch it. We tiptoed around it like it might explode. As he turned to leave, Whiskey let out a soft bark and padded after him. Reed knelt, scratched the dog's head, and whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he looked back at me, once eyes searching. I didn't think I'd ever see you again. I didn't answer. Just stood there, a ghost in the doorway of the life I once ran from. He closed the door behind him, and the quiet settled like dust in a forgotten room. Whiskey laid down beside my bag and let out a deep sigh. I sat on the couch, still holding my breath, staring at the door like it had answers. And for the first time in 3 years, I wondered what might have happened if I hadn't left when I did. I barely made it to the laundry room before the tears burned hot behind my eyes. Not the kind that fall right away. No. These were the kind that sting quietly, the kind you hold back out of sheer will, because if you let them go, they might never stop. I leaned against the washer, fingers gripping the edge like it might anchor me to the present. But nothing felt real. Not the house, not the dog curled up in the hallway, and definitely not the fact that I had just come face to face with the only man I ever loved and left. The smell hit me first. A faint mix of detergent and cedar. The same kind of detergent I used to use when we lived in that tiny apartment downtown. The memory hit hard and uninvited, like a wave I'd forgotten was coming. I sat down on the lid of the washer, tucked my knees to my chest, and let my mind drift backward. It wasn't a dramatic ending. That's the part people never understand. There were no screaming matches, no doors slammed, no betrayal, no third party. Just a slow unraveling of a girl who didn't know how to stay. I remembered the night before I left. Reed had made pasta his version of comfort food, always too much garlic. He'd lit one of those stupid candles. I hated the kind that smelled like musky tobacco and fake leather, and insisted we eat at the dining table instead of in front of the TV. I knew even then what he was trying to do. He was grounding me, tethering me to something solid so I wouldn't float away again. But it was already too late. I didn't sleep that night. I just watched him from across the bed, his back rising and falling with each breath. There was something about the stillness of his body that made everything louder in my head. My doubt, my fear, the voices that told me I was always going to ruin the good things before they ruined me first. So I left before sunrise, left a note that didn't say much, just enough not to be cruel. I didn't take all my things, just what fit in a duffel. I didn't want to watch the door close. I didn't want to hear him wake up and call after me. I wanted a clean break. But Reed, he wasn't the kind of man you get a clean break from. And I should have known that when I turned the corner at the end of the street, I'd look back just once. He was standing on the porch, holding the note. No shoes, just barefoot on cold wood. In his hand, the paper trembled slightly. But he didn't shout, didn't chase. He just looked at me. And I've never been the same since. There was something in that look. Not anger, not heartbreak. Just quiet understanding, like he saw every fractured part of me and decided not to stop me anyway. Because maybe he knew chasing me wouldn't change anything. Maybe he understood that people who run need to run. But now, 3 years later, I wasn't running. I was here, in his laundry room, sitting on his washer like some broken memory that showed up out of nowhere. And I didn't know what to do with that. I wiped my eyes, stood and splashed water on my face from the utility sink. I told myself to be professional. Just one night. Feed the dog. Lock the doors. Pretend this was just another gig. But as I stepped back into the hallway, I saw Whiskey still curled by the couch, eyes half closed but watching me like he knew. Dogs always know. And that made it harder. Because if he knew, maybe Reed still did too. You never really forget the way a diamond catches light. Even now, years later, I still remember the exact one he gave me. Not because it was the biggest I'd ever seen, it wasn't, but because of the way his hand trembled when he held it out. The way his eyes searched my face, waiting for something he couldn't name. It was supposed to be temporary. I was 23, working at my aunt's jewelry shop in downtown Nashville. I'd been raised around gold dust and garnet shavings, taught to use tweezers like a violinist uses a bow. I loved it, losing hours shaping tiny stones into something someone else would use to say forever. Reed walked in on a Thursday. He was looking for a gift for his mother. Said he wanted something personal, but not too flashy. He didn't look like the usual trust fund types we got around there. He wore jeans and a flannel no assistant trailing behind him. But the way he looked at the cases, like he'd never had to ask the price of anything in his life. I helped him choose a pair of emerald studs. When he came back 2 days later, it wasn't about the earrings. "You got the hands of someone who makes things last," he said, watching me solder a chain behind the counter. I laughed. I wasn't used to being noticed not like that. What started as coffee breaks turned into late-night walks. He'd pick me up in his truck, the one his father hated, and drive nowhere in particular, just far enough from city lights to see stars. He told me he hated the country clubs, the suits, the legacy. "I want to build something different," he said once, fingers laced with mine over the console. "Not just inherit it." I believed him, even when we kept things quiet, even when he'd kiss me in the back alley behind the shop instead of out on the sidewalk. Even when he introduced me to his dog but never to his father. I told myself we were just protecting something fragile. And then, one night, he brought me a ring. It wasn't in a velvet box. It wasn't with flowers or a speech. It was wrapped in an old cloth tucked inside his jacket pocket. "This is all I can give you right now," he said. "Not because I don't want more, because the timing's a mess. But it's yours if you still want it." I nodded before I could think. He slipped it on my finger in the passenger seat of his truck, the dashboard lights flickering against the stone. We didn't call it an engagement, not out loud, but I wore that ring like it meant a promise. We had plans, quiet ones. He'd wait until the fiscal year turned, until his father stepped back. Then he'd tell the board, the press, whoever needed to hear it. "She's not the problem," he told me once. "She's the reason I want to do this right." But the truth, he never did tell them. And I never asked why. Maybe I was afraid of the answer. Because love, when it's hidden too long, begins to suffocate. And the tighter you try to hold it, the more it starts to feel like a secret you're ashamed of. I used to trace the shape of that ring in the dark, wondering what it would feel like to wear it in the light. I never got the chance. One day I left it on the nightstand, right next to his note. Some heartbreaks don't come with screaming matches or slammed doors. They come with silence. And a name you weren't supposed to read in the newspaper. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because Tuesdays were always slow at the shop, and I had just finished sketching a new setting for a rose-cut sapphire. Aunt Marlene had left the paper open on the counter while brewing coffee. And there it was, page 3, society column, just beneath the latest city council scandal. Mallory Sinclair and Reed Whitmore announce engagement. The ink smudged where my fingers touched the corner. It wasn't even a flattering photo. She looked stiff in that pale pink suit, like someone told her to smile, but forgot to tell her why. Reed stood next to her in a charcoal blazer, arm lightly at her back, face unreadable. But I didn't need to read his expression. I had once known every shift in his eyes, every nervous twitch of his hand. That man in the photo wasn't the boy who brought me midnight sandwiches or whispered big dreams on the hood of his truck. That man looked like his father's son. And yet, he was wearing the watch I gave him. That small, defiant detail gutted me more than anything else. He hadn't called, hadn't written, hadn't come by. The last time we spoke, he kissed me goodnight and said, "Soon." And now soon had a different meaning. I didn't cry. Not right away. I just sat down, still holding the sketch pad in one hand, and read the article again, as if reading it twice might change the words. It didn't. That afternoon, I slipped the ring, the one he gave me, in his truck into a velvet pouch. I placed it next to the unfinished design I'd been working on for weeks. It was supposed to be a custom engagement piece, something he'd asked me to play with in secret. A ring that wasn't for the press or the board or Mallory Sinclair. It was for me. I didn't sign the design, didn't leave a note. Just tucked it all into a little box and slid it under the door of his condo. Then I walked away. I didn't pack much, just a suitcase, my tools, and one good coat. I left the key to the apartment with Aunt Marlene and took the first bus out of Nashville the next morning. No one asked questions. Maybe because they already knew the answer. You don't vanish because you want to disappear. You vanish because staying would mean watching the life you imagined belong to someone else. I traveled light for a while, hopped towns, took gigs fixing antique watches, resizing heirlooms. I stayed in places just long enough to make rent and leave no trace. I told people my name was Elle, short for nothing, meaningless and clean. I told myself I was free. But the thing about ghosts is, you carry them with you. And some memories don't fade, they just go quiet, waiting for the right silence to speak again. I woke before the sun. The house was still. One of those quiets that doesn't come from peace, but from the weight of too many words left unsaid. I padded down the hall, barefoot fingers grazing the cold railing. The kitchen lights were dim, but enough to see the shape curled up on the mat by the fridge. Whiskey. He lifted his head, blinked at me like I'd never left. Like I hadn't missed 3 years of walks and belly rubs and sleeping beside the couch when thunder rolled through. He stretched, tail wagging once, twice, then pressed his face against my knee like it was still ours. I dropped to the floor and buried my fingers in his fur. "I missed you too," I whispered. A creak behind me. I turned to find Reed in the doorway, hair-tousled sweatshirt pulled over what I knew used to be pressed button-downs. His hand gripped the frame like he didn't mean to be there but couldn't leave either. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," I replied. He stepped inside slow and careful, like I might vanish if he moved too fast. "Tea," I nodded. "Still, keep the good stuff." He managed a smile, small, uneven. "Only for emergencies." He moved around the kitchen in a rhythm I remembered reach, boil, steep. But his hands weren't steady. I noticed it when he opened the cabinet and the mugs clinked, or when he poured the water just a little too quickly, some of it splashing on the counter. He set the mug down in front of me. Chamomile. My favorite. I didn't thank him. I didn't need to. We sat in silence for a while. Whiskey snored between us. The only sounds were the occasional click of ceramic and the hum of the fridge. I watched the steam curl from the mug, trying not to look at his hands, or the faint scar just under his jawline I didn't remember. "So, he's still afraid of thunder?" I asked finally. Reed nodded. "And vacuums." I smiled without meaning to. That never changed. He looked at me then, not through me, not around me, but at me. And for a second I saw something in his face that made my chest ache. Not regret, not anger, just tired love. The kind that sits heavy behind your ribs too long unspoken. "How long are you staying?" he asked. I shrugged. "Just covering the shift. After that, it's not up to me." He looked like he wanted to ask more, but didn't. "Thanks for stepping in," he said instead. "It's been a rough few weeks." I sipped my tea. "Didn't do it for you." "I know." But something about the way his voice dipped on that last word made me think he didn't. Not entirely. The conversation ended there. Not because we ran out of things to say, but because we were still too afraid of saying the wrong thing, or the right thing too soon. He stood, rinsed his mug, and paused before leaving. "I'll be working out back today. You'll have the house to yourself." I nodded. "Good." But before he stepped away, he added almost as an afterthought, "Let me know if whiskey gives you trouble." I looked down at the dog curled against my foot like I'd never left. "I don't think he remembers how." Reed smiled again. This time it reached the corner of his eyes. "It started with thunder. Not the loud kind that crashes through windows, but the low kind, like a warning in the bones." The sky outside the workshop had darkened, clouds settling in with the kind of slow certainty that made the air feel heavy even indoors. I'd been sanding a small wooden box in the corner of the sunroom, trying to keep myself busy, trying not to think about the hallway upstairs or the mug he handed me, or how I still knew where he kept the tea. Whiskey patted in without a sound. He curled at my feet like always, but his ears twitched at the first distant rumble. Then another, then a closer one. By the time the lights flickered, he was already trembling. I dropped the sander. It was automatic how my hands found his head, how my body curled around him the way it used to on stormy nights in Nashville. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and I whispered nonsense into his fur like I'd never stopped. "I've got you," I murmured. "It's just noise. I've got you." He didn't calm. That was when I felt it, a shadow behind me, then warmth. Reed's hand brushed my shoulder and I flinched before I could stop myself. "Sorry," he said gently. "Didn't mean to scare you." I turned slightly. His other hand reached out slow and unsure until his fingers rested just beside mine where they both touched Whiskey's trembling frame. We were close enough that I could see the pale scar along his wrist, the way his thumb moved in small circles, comforting the dog or maybe himself. "Storm's rolling straight over us," he said. "Should pass soon." I nodded, eyes still on Whiskey. "He hates this." I remember. His voice was low. It stirred something old and unspoken inside me. A memory of another night. Another storm. Another time when we sat like this on the floor of a tiny apartment, pretending the world outside wasn't falling apart. I looked up and caught him watching me. Not watching the dog. Not the storm. Me. The same way he had the night I walked out. The night I left the ring, the sketches, and everything we might have been. That look equal parts question and ache. As if he wanted to ask why, but already knew he'd never get the answer. The thunder cracked louder this time, and Whiskey whimpered. Instinctively, I wrapped my arms tighter around him, and Reed's hand brushed mine again. "You're good with him," he said. "You trained him," I replied. "Not to sit still during storms." I exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. His gaze hadn't left me. It was steady, unreadable. But there was something softer there, too. Something like hope. Or maybe it was just memory. "You look different," he said suddenly. I looked down at myself. Older. "No," he said, voice quieter. Just quieter. It wasn't an insult. I knew what he meant. There had been noise in me once, big dreams, sharp laughs, the sound of hammers on metal in a borrowed workshop where we used to meet after midnight. I had been so full of fire then, and so quick to run when it burned. "You too," I whispered. He didn't ask what I meant. Maybe he already knew. The storm outside began to fade. The thunder grew distant, like a conversation ending in the next room. Whiskey's breathing slowed. Reed didn't move. Neither did I. For a moment we sat there, two people who had once belonged in the same story, now sharing a page again, out of sequence, out of time, but still legible in each other's eyes. And for the first time since I'd arrived, I didn't want to leave the room. Not yet. There's a drawer in the kitchen I've always hated. The kind that sticks halfway full of warranties, expired coupons, batteries that may or may not work. A junk drawer. I was looking for a spoon of all things. But when I yanked the drawer open, something wedged behind a dead flashlight caught my eye. A folded piece of linen paper. Heavyweight. Watermarked. Not something you'd jot a grocery list on. I hesitated, then pulled it free. It was a letter. Not addressed to anyone. Just words careful and restrained in the slanted handwriting I once loved, watching curl around ring sketches and margins of napkins. Reed, Whitmore, Mallory. By the time you read this, I hope you've forgiven me. It wasn't dated, but I knew exactly when it had been written. 3 years ago, the night I left the news, came the very next morning. Mrs. Mallory Reed's mother had died. Cancer. Quietly, privately. The family hadn't told anyone how far it had gone, and that was the last day I allowed myself to say his name aloud. But reading that letter now in this kitchen where I didn't belong, I saw it all again through his eyes. The expectations, the legacy, the trap. They weren't just Whitmore's, they were Mallory's. Two old Southern dynasties wrapped in wine country and silent auctions and land deeds older than Tennessee itself. Reed wasn't just a son. He was the son. The one expected to inherit the vineyards, the board seats, the legacy that came with a price tag no one discussed except behind doors late at night, when women like Mrs. Mallory reminded their sons who they were born to become. And so, after she passed, it wasn't just grief he carried. It was guilt. A promise she made her husband make. A promise his father made to him, to marry Mallory Hawthorne. The Hawthornes owned most of the hillside east of Franklin. Their merger wasn't just romantic fiction, it was business. Optics. Land preservation, wealth, consolidation, political advantage. Reed had told me once in a whisper barely louder than the hum of the kiln. There's a part of me that was spoken for before I was even born. I hadn't understood then. I hadn't wanted to. So when he stopped answering my calls, when the newspaper showed his face beside hers at a gala, I had no invitation to. I filled the silence with stories of betrayal. It was easier than the truth, that he didn't choose her. He chose them, his name, his land, his dead mother's last request. I folded the letter back, hands trembling. Maybe I shouldn't have read it, but maybe I needed to. Because for the first time I realized he had vanished, not because he didn't love me, but because loving me meant setting fire to everything that had raised him. And at 24, maybe neither of us was brave enough for that. I closed the drawer and sat at the table. Whiskey lay beside my feet, his breath soft and rhythmic. And I thought of Reed, how he had looked at me during the storm. Not like a man trying to explain the past, but like someone who didn't believe he deserved a second look. And maybe just, maybe, he didn't. But now I wasn't sure I could keep pretending that all he gave up was me. He gave up a part of himself too. A part I had never tried to understand. Until now. I never told anyone I left Nashville at 4:17 a.m. No dramatic exit, no bags flung into cabs, no slamming doors or shouted accusations. Just silence, like a scene fading out before the credits roll. The city was still sleeping when I locked the studio for the last time. I placed the sketchbook on the center table open to the last page. The ring design I'd never shown him. It wasn't extravagant. Just a clean arc twin vines braided together, and in the center not a diamond, but a rough-cut Montana sapphire. Soft blue. Like his eyes when he laughed without trying to hide it. That laugh had become rare by the end. So had visits. So had explanations. But that night I wasn't angry. Not really. I was hollowed out. Like someone had reached inside and carefully taken everything soft, leaving only skin and the echo of what used to be. I left the sketch with a small square of linen, his handkerchief the one he always tucked into his breast pocket but never used. He once told me it had belonged to his grandfather. I'd used it once. The night I cried in his car outside the Mallory estate when I realized I would never belong there. Never walk those halls without a whisper following me. He'd wiped my tears with it, folded it gently, and said, "I hate that you need to use this, but I'm glad it's me here to give it." I kept it. Until I didn't. He came 2 hours later. I don't know how I know that, but I do. Reed never told me what he saw that morning. He didn't have to. I imagined it 1,000 times. He would have unlocked the door, he still had a key, and stepped into a room that felt colder than it should have. The coffee pot empty. The kiln off. No hum from the back room. Just that page. That ring. That handkerchief. And dust where love used to live. I wonder if he touched the sketch. If he traced the lines with his finger and saw all the words I hadn't written. I loved you. I would have said yes. But you never asked. I wonder if he sat down. Just for a second. To breathe. To ask the walls why I left when they'd always held our secrets. To ask himself why he never came sooner. I wonder if he searched the apartment for notes for keepsakes, for some sign of me tucked between the folds of what remained. He wouldn't have found anything. I'd taken everything I couldn't bear for him to see. 3 years later, I stood in his house watching the rain carve silver lines on the windows, and I knew without asking that he had never thrown that page away. He kept it. I saw it once half folded inside a hardcover book in the living room. I didn't say anything, and neither did he. Because some goodbyes aren't spoken. Some are just spaces. A room too quiet. A morning too late. And some are the things we leave behind not to punish, not to explain, but because we need to believe someone will care enough to wonder. Maybe that's all we ever were, a sketch half finished and a linen square left for someone who never stopped hoping we might come back and finish what we started. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep it unfinished anymore. It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed. I was halfway through sorting the invoices from the studio, surrounded by half-drunk tea and cold air, when I saw his name flash across the screen. Reed Whitmore. I hesitated. We'd spent 2 days coexisting in the same house like polite ghosts. He didn't press. I didn't linger. We circled each other in silence, kept our stories in separate drawers. Until now. I picked up. "Whiskey hasn't eaten since noon," he said. His voice was tight, like he'd been holding it in for hours. "He's trembling, and I don't know what else to do." That dog, that stubborn, loyal, hurricane-fearing ball of fur had survived more storms than either of us. And still he only ate if I was in the room. "I'm on my way," I whispered. The house was dark when I got there. Reed opened the door looking like he hadn't breathed properly since the last time I left. He didn't say anything, just stepped aside to let me through. Whiskey lay curled on a faded blanket near the fireplace. He opened one eye when he saw me, let out a pitiful huff, and tried to sit up. "Hey, old boy," I murmured, kneeling beside him. He nuzzled my palm with his damp nose, then licked my wrist. I felt something in me crack quietly, like a window that had been shut too long, finally letting in air. I coaxed him toward the bowl. Reed brought warm chicken broth and knelt beside me, holding the dish like it was something holy. Whiskey lapped at it, slowly, weak but willing. Reed exhaled, a sound that almost broke me. "Thank you," he said softly. I nodded, brushing fur from my jeans. Then, for the first time since I'd come back, we didn't move away from each other. We sat on the floor side by side in the half-light of the fireplace. "Does he still sleep in your bed?" I asked, just to fill the air. "He does." Reed smiled faintly, "though he's got his own pillow now." We both laughed, the kind of laugh that carries more memory than humor. Then silence again. Not the heavy kind this time, more like something waiting. "He stopped eating after you left, you know," Reed said. "Back then. I took him to 5 vets. They said he was grieving." I looked at Whiskey, now dozing between us. "He's smarter than most people," I murmured. Reed's eyes found mine. "He knew you loved him." I stared at the fire. That wasn't enough, was it? There it was. Not about the dog. Not really. "No," he said. "But not because you left." I turned to him slowly. He wasn't wearing the expensive suits anymore. Just a soft gray sweater, sleeves pushed up, worry still etched into his brow. "I never told you what happened," he said. "Why I didn't call. Why the announcement went public before I could stop it. I didn't want excuses," I said. "I know. But I needed you to know it wasn't my choice. The engagement wasn't love. It was obligation. My father was dying, Lena. He made me promise to keep the families aligned. And so you gave me up." He looked down at his hands. "I thought I was protecting you. That's the lie we tell ourselves, Reed, when we're really just too afraid to choose." He didn't argue, just nodded like he'd been waiting for those words. "I should have fought for you," he said quietly. I reached over and scratched Whiskey's ear. "You still have him," I said. "That's more than most people get." "And you," I didn't answer. Couldn't. Not yet. But I didn't leave either. We sat there until the fire turned to coals, and Whiskey snored softly between us like nothing had ever gone wrong. And in the hush of that moment, I realized the first real conversation we'd had in years wasn't about betrayal or pain. It was about a dog. And maybe that's where healing always begins, not with declarations, but with shared silences, and someone who remembers how you liked your tea. The next morning, I found myself in the sunroom again. Whiskey was stretched across the rug like royalty, snoring softly. Reed was in the kitchen, humming under his breath while scrambling eggs. It felt domestic, dangerous. I was sipping coffee when he slid a small wooden box across the table. No words, just the box. The lid was worn, the hinges a bit rusted. I knew it immediately. I hadn't seen it in years. With cautious fingers, I opened it. Inside, nestled carefully in soft cloth, was the unfinished ring design. My design. Still raw, still flawed, still ours. Next to it, folded with impossible precision, was the handkerchief I'd left behind, embroidered corner, tiny fray on the hem. My breath caught. My fingers trembled. I kept them, Reed said, voice low. Why? I managed. Because you didn't take them with you. I looked up sharply. That's not a reason. No, he agreed. It's not. But I needed something to prove to myself that it wasn't all in my head, that you were real, that we were. He sat across from me, hands clasped, like a man confessing a sin. I didn't marry Mallory. The words landed softly, too softly for how much they broke open in my chest. What? He nodded. The engagement was announced to please our families, especially after my mother died. It gave my father peace in his last months. But I never followed through. The wedding was postponed, then quietly canceled. And Mallory agreed to that. She was relieved. She had someone else. Always had. We were just the story they wanted to tell. I stared at him, the box between us like a bridge we never crossed. You let me believe. I started, then stopped. I know, he said. I thought it was kinder, cleaner, letting you go without dragging you through the mud of it all. I shook my head. You don't get to decide what's easier for me. He looked like a man who'd carried that guilt for years and still didn't know where to put it down. I used to run my fingers along that sketch, he said, wondering if you would have stayed if I'd chosen differently. Wondering if you still would have made that ring even after everything. I was going to, I said quietly. Finish it. Give it to you. Not as an heirloom or engagement piece. Just as something made by my hands. Something that proved I knew you. He swallowed hard. I would have worn it every day, he said. I almost laughed. Or cried. Or both. Do you realize how insane all this sounds? I asked. You hear? Me feeding your dog. And a half-made ring that somehow outlived our relationship. He smiled sheepishly. It's not the only thing I kept. I raised an eyebrow. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old Polaroid. The two of us on a Ferris wheel, me laughing, him grinning like he'd just won the world. You used to hate this photo, I whispered. Said your hair looked stupid. He shrugged. It still does. I stared at it, remembering the cotton candy and the wind and how safe his arms had felt. It's not fair, I said. To dig all this up now. To make it feel alive again when it should have stayed buried. I know, he said. But you're doing it anyway. He didn't reply. Just placed the photo beside the ring and the handkerchief. I stood, needing space, needing breath. But I didn't leave. Because maybe, just maybe, I wanted to see what else he had kept. And if anything inside me had remained untouched, unbroken, maybe I kept something too. I couldn't sleep. The house was too still, too full of unsaid things. Even Whiskey's breathing, soft and steady at the foot of the bed, couldn't quiet the thoughts bouncing around in my skull. I got up. My feet remembered the floor plan better than I did. They carried me down the narrow hall to the den, past the creaky board that still sang under pressure, and toward the bookshelf where Reed used to hide things he didn't want anyone to find. Behind a row of vintage cookbooks, I found it. The tin box. It was dented at the corner, the floral design chipped from age. My initials were still scratched faintly into the lid, right above a wonky heart Reed had carved with a blunt letter opener when we were barely old enough to spell forever. I hesitated. Then opened it. Inside were pieces of a time I had almost convinced myself didn't matter. Scraps of old receipts with silly notes, a faded concert ticket from a band we both hated but danced to anyway, and a paper napkin where I had sketched his profile while he talked about restoring his grandfather's watch. And at the bottom was the sketch. The first one, folded with care like it had been opened and closed 100 times but never discarded. The ring was different in that early draft, rougher, messier. The lines were too bold, the measurements too large, but the core was unmistakable. It was us, Our initials woven into the band in Morse code his idea. The curve inspired by a river we used to sit beside in early spring. The setting tilted slightly off-center because he liked things that weren't trying to be perfect. On the back in his slanted handwriting was a single sentence. If this ever finds its way back to you, finish it. I sat down, or maybe collapsed. The box clattered beside me. I remembered when he gave it to me weeks before things fell apart. We had stayed up all night passing the sketchbook back and forth like kids sharing secrets. He'd laughed at how seriously I took every proportion. I'd rolled my eyes at how quickly he abandoned the grid lines for instinct. But this was the only version he kept. The flawed one. The one made before fear crept in. I brushed my thumb across the ink. It wasn't about the ring. Not really. It was about permission. About trusting me to finish what he couldn't. About believing that I'd see through the mess to something worth keeping. A part of me wanted to storm back into his room and ask why he hid it, why he never mailed it, why he let me walk away carrying the weight of a lie. But another part, the part that had been aching since the moment I stepped back into this house, understood. He didn't hide it to forget. He kept it to remember. To remember that once he wanted something enough to draw it even if he couldn't hold on to it. Whiskey stirred his paws, tapping softly across the wooden floor until he reached me. He pressed his head into my thigh like he knew something had cracked open inside me. I stroked his ears, then looked back at the sketch. I could still finish it. Not for him. Not even for us. But for the girl, I used to be the one who believed that love was something you could build with your hands, who believed that even broken things could be made whole. The tin box closed with a soft click, and in that quiet I realized something that scared me more than the past ever had. I wasn't just remembering anymore. I was hoping. I didn't text him back. Not after the night he showed me the sketch he had kept. Not after I found the tin box with his message. Not after I sat in the dark holding two versions of the same memory, his and mine, and realized they had never truly left me. Instead, I pulled out my old drafting kit. It had been tucked away in a moving box, marked fragile but forgotten. The pencils were dull, the erasers stiff, but my hand knew where everything was. Even the lined paper smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. I sharpened a pencil until the wood curled like a ribbon. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the one place in the house that hadn't absorbed his presence, and unfolded the sketch. It stared back at me like a dare. My fingers hovered, unsure. I hadn't designed anything in years. Not seriously. I'd taught classes on basics, made custom repairs in quiet shops, but I hadn't created in so long it scared me to try. And yet, when I touched the graphite to the paper, my hand moved like it remembered the dream before it broke. I started with the center stone. That was always the heart of it. Reed had wanted something asymmetrical, a marquise cut, but tilted, nestled in a cradle of tension bars instead of prongs. He used to say he liked rings that looked like they were barely holding on but still whole. Like us. The lines came slowly, measured. My hand trembled on the first stroke. A shallow curve. I had to pause. This wasn't just a sketch anymore. This was a memory I was drawing with muscle and silence. This was a piece of myself, raw, still sore, being shaped into something that looked like art. I kept going. The stone formed, then the channel setting around it. I adjusted the band, narrowed the arch, slightly refined the Morse code initials to fit the updated size. I didn't need to look anything up. We had drawn it a dozen times back then, each version slightly different, but the core always stayed. We'd whispered changes under blankets, on cafe napkins, over takeout containers. The ring had been ours in theory, even if never in reality. This one was different, though. This one had a finish. And I was the one to give it. When I lifted the pencil, the room was quiet again. No thunder, no voices, no apologies. Just the final design. Complete. I stared at it for a long while. Not because it was perfect, it wasn't, but because it was honest. Because I had chosen to pick up the pencil. After all this time. After all that silence. Because even if I never showed him, never said a word, I needed to know I still could. I placed the finished draft beside the old one. They looked like echoes of each other. Versions from different lifetimes. Hers was hopeful and wild. Mine was tired but resolved. I folded both. Slipped them into a new envelope. Not addressed. Not sealed. Just ready. In case I ever wanted him to know that I hadn't just kept the memory. I had finished the ring. I wasn't sure why I signed up for the artisan fair. Maybe it was guilt. Or unfinished business. Or maybe I just missed the version of myself who once believed a ring could change a life. It had been 3 years since I last set foot at the Nashville Summer Makers Fair. Back then, my booth had been tucked between a candle vendor and a woman who sold hand-carved spoons. I'd spent most of that weekend pretending not to watch Reed whisper to wealthy donors at the Mallory Foundation tent. This time I brought only one piece. One ring. The one I had finished at my kitchen table. I didn't frame it or mount it on velvet. Just displayed it on a sheet of glass under soft light. I didn't need it to sell. I needed it to exist in the world finished. The morning air buzzed with chatter and the scent of cinnamon and glue. Children darted between stalls. Folk music strummed lazily from a speaker no one could find. I was adjusting the lighting when I heard it. A soft bark. I froze. Only one dog I knew barked like that, low, uncertain, like a question. Whiskey. I turned slowly. And there he was, standing by the same oak tree he used to lean against when waiting for me. Back when we had inside jokes and an us-shaped future. Back when everything felt possible. Reed wasn't wearing a suit today. Just a faded navy t-shirt, jeans, and that tan leather band I once made him now aged to a deeper brown. He looked more like the boy who kissed me behind my grandfather's barn, less like the heir who let me go without a word. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just nodded, hands in pockets, eyes steady. Whiskey wagged his tail once and sat down like he understood this wasn't a moment for barking. I stepped out from behind my booth. People passed between us carrying jars of jam and knitted scarves, oblivious to the electricity in the stillness. We didn't rush, didn't smile, just walked until we stood a few feet apart, no table, no dog, no ring between us. "It's good to see you," he said softly. I swallowed. "You waited. I wasn't sure you'd come." I looked down at Whiskey. I wasn't either. He crouched to pet the dog who nudged his head into Reed's palm like always. Then Reed reached into his back pocket and pulled out something small. My breath caught. It was the first napkin sketch. The one from that rainy afternoon when we couldn't afford fancy paper but we had big ideas. "I carry it every year," he said, brushing the crease flat. "Just in case." I blinked hard. The sunlight was too much all of a sudden. He stood again, his voice quiet. "I never forgot what we made, or why it mattered." I nodded toward my booth. "It's finished. The ring." His eyebrows lifted. "Can I see it?" I gestured. "Of course." We walked back in silence. People smiled at him, but he didn't break focus. When he reached the display, he didn't reach for the ring. Just looked at it. Like it was holy. "I always wondered how you'd end it," he said. I looked at him. So did I. A long pause stretched between us. Finally, he asked, "Can I commission the first casting?" My lips curled. "For who?" He hesitated, then said simply, "For whoever you want it to be for." I didn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time, I didn't feel like running. I turned back to the crowd and the sunlight and the booth that held a single finished ring, and beside me stood the man who once let me go. Maybe we were both here now, not for what had been lost, but for what could still be made. I didn't expect him to follow. But as I turned from the booth, the sketch still warm from my fingers, I heard the soft rhythm of his steps beside mine. We didn't speak, didn't smile. There was no need to fill the quiet with explanations that would only unravel what was finally settling between us. I held the folded design in one hand. Not the finished ring, the sketch. A reworked version clearer than the napkin version, but not as polished as the glass displayed piece. It was a blueprint of something neither past nor future. He noticed it. His eyes flicked down, but he didn't ask. I handed it to him. Still walking. He opened it slowly like it might break, and looked at it as we strolled past stalls of woodcraft and kettle corn. The center stone was the same. Oval, clean, no halo. The prongs curved inward slightly, an echo of the way his fingers once cupped my chin before a kiss. Around it, a new detail, 2 tiny indents on the inner band meant to be filled later with stones only the wearer could see. Private markers, invisible to the world. His breath caught, but he still didn't say anything. We kept walking. Past the booth where we once bought matching enamel pins. Past the corner where he spilled lemonade on my sketchbook and spent an hour apologizing with terrible poetry. Now there was only silence, but it wasn't empty. It was full. Of what we'd never said. Of what didn't need to be said anymore. He folded the paper and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Still no words. He didn't ask what it meant. Didn't ask if it was for him. Didn't ask if I'd ever forgive him. And I didn't ask if he ever truly regretted it all. The day was winding down. Sunlight stretched long shadows across the pavement. A child ran past us with sticky fingers and a balloon that escaped a second later into the sky. Whiskey trotted behind us, content. At the park edge where the booths thinned and the grass took over, Reed stopped. He looked out across the field, then down at his hand. He touched the spot where the paper rested over his heart. I don't know what happens next, he said, his voice low, barely more than air. But I know what I want it to feel like. I waited. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I reached out, brushed his arm once, light as breath. We didn't link fingers, didn't kiss, didn't promise anything. We just stood there, with the grass around our shoes and 3 years behind our backs. And ahead, I didn't know. But as I watched him place the folded sketch carefully into his wallet where old promises used to live, I realized something. We didn't start over today. We didn't even reconcile. But we met. Here. Again. Not as strangers or lovers or regret. Just as 2 people finally walking in the same direction at the same pace, no longer afraid of the quiet between them. Sometimes that's the closest thing to peace you get. And sometimes it's enough. It was a Tuesday when I opened the shop. Not a grand opening, not a ribbon-cutting ceremony. Just me, a broom, and a paper sign that read, "Closed for private work. Knock gently if you're curious." I didn't advertise, didn't blast it online or print flyers. But somehow by noon there were 3 curious knocks. And by Friday, I had my first order. I called the place Dust and Light. The name came from a phrase I once whispered to a dog on a stormy night, trying to explain why certain jewels shone brighter in shadows. The space was tiny, a storefront with 2 display cases and a narrow counter, plus a cramped back room that always smelled faintly of metal and pine oil. The ring in the first case center stage wasn't for sale. It sat on soft velvet, the design carefully engraved beneath it, designed in silence, finished in faith. Some people asked about it. I always smiled and said that one's spoken for. Only a few noticed the initials barely etched into the inner curve. R&L, so small you needed a loop. The funny thing, Reed never set foot in the front. He wasn't comfortable with attention. Said he'd had enough cameras and curated smiles in his lifetime. But in the back room, he was everything. He fixed the wobbly shelf that held my polishing kits, installed the new hinges on the cabinet when my elbow gave out, delivered lunch when I forgot time existed, And every Thursday morning, like clockwork, he brought me fresh coffee and a new quote scribbled on the cup sleeve. Today's read: "Love isn't loud. It just refuses to leave." We didn't live together. Not yet. We didn't wear rings. Not yet. But there was something about how he rolled up his sleeves and wiped dust off my jeweler's bench without being asked. Something more binding than any ceremony. Sometimes customers would mention him. That quiet man who walks your dog and waits outside with a book, and I'd nod, simply saying, "That's Reed." They didn't need to know more. He never asked to be the face of anything, just wanted to be the hands behind what I built. In the evenings, we'd close shop together. He'd lock the door while I turned off the lights. Whiskey would yawn dramatically, already halfway asleep near the counter stool. We didn't speak much about the past anymore. We didn't have to. The unspoken had softened between us. The sharpness dulled by time, by choice, by effort. One night, as I was closing the drawer that held our earliest sketches, Reed stood beside me with a velvet pouch in his hand. "I found something," he said. I raised an eyebrow. He opened it, and out slid a pendant, silver oval shaped with two tiny notches cut into its inner rim. One held a sliver of moonstone, the other empty. "For the stone you choose," he said, "when you're ready." It wasn't a ring, not a proposal, just another piece in our story, unfinished, waiting. I smiled, took the pendant, and for the first time since Nashville, my hand didn't shake when I said, "I think I already know which stone." That night, as we turned the lights off again, I caught a glimpse of our reflection in the glass. Me slightly older, wiser perhaps. Him just the same, but with softer edges. And between us, a quiet, steady space that no longer hurt. Just held. Just held. I've learned not all stories end with a kiss. Some just soften into something you carry. Quietly. Daily. It was late autumn when a young couple walked into the shop. They couldn't have been more than 25, wide-eyed, nervous, holding hands like they were holding on to the last piece of courage they had. "We don't know much about jewelry," the girl said, laughing, "but we saw your sign and something just felt right." She pointed to the ring in the center case. "That one. It's beautiful. Is it for sale?" I paused. For a second I imagined saying yes, letting it go, letting that part of my life finally belong to someone else. But my hand moved before my thoughts did. I closed the case gently. "I'm sorry," I said. "That one's already been spoken for." They understood, smiled, picked something else. And as I wrapped their purchase and handed it over, I felt it again, that subtle hum in my chest. Not pain, not longing, just memory. The kind that stays. The kind you don't rewrite even if you could. A few minutes later, I heard the bell chime again. Footsteps familiar enough to make my breath catch. Reed stepped inside. The first time he'd crossed that threshold. He didn't say a word. Just walked to the counter, looked at the ring still glinting behind the glass, and then looked at me. "She already said yes," he whispered. I didn't respond. Didn't need to. He knew. We weren't defined by declarations anymore. We were defined by days, by moments, by what we didn't let go of. There's a photograph on my workshop wall now. Not framed, just pinned like a sketch in progress. It's of a hand, not mine, not Reed's, but worn and gentle, holding the ring we designed together. Beneath it, scribbled in faded pencil, some designs were never meant to be sold, only finished. I look at it often when I feel lost. And when people ask about my story, I don't tell them about the heartbreak the years apart, or the near miss that almost cost us everything. I tell them this. Not everyone who says they'll stay, stays. But sometimes the ones who never promised anything, they're the ones who show up and stay. Like the ring I never threw away, like the man who never asked me to come back but waited anyway.